Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. Welcome aboard to Impact Australia Wind session, capitalizing on Australia onshore and offshore wind potential. My name is Molly Huang, Content Manager of Leader Associates Impact and your facilitator of today's session. In case some of you may missed out our event yesterday on hydrogen future in Australia, I'd like to briefly introduce who we are again at Leader Associates and what this Impact series is all about. Leader Associates is an international clean energy event organizer covering solar, wind, energy storage, and hydrogen. We set sail in Perth of Australia in 2015 by hosting our very first Australia Solar Plus Energy Storage Congress. Over the past 6 years, we've grown rapidly with footprints expanded to Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. On December the 7th to 9th, our physical event, Australia Wind Energy 2021, will be co-located with Connecting Green Hydrogen APEC 2021 and the Solar Energy Future 2021 in Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre. It is a major gathering for the APEC energy community. And the Impact Online series itself, as a part of Leader Associates Global RE initiative, is a digital intelligence platform that teams up with global energy leaders, administrations, practitioners, and forward thinkers to drive social-wide approach on sustainable transition and to inspire business growth from good to great. Wind power is Australia's leading source of clean energy. In 2020, onshore wind farm with a combined capacity of 7.4 gigawatt supplied over 35% of the country's clean energy and nearly 10% of Australia's total electricity. A further 21 onshore wind farms with a combined capacity of more than 4 gigawatt is under construction or has reached financial commitments. What's more, we see a rising offshore wind industry in Australia with the latest introduction of Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Bill 2021 on early September, which opens a door for more than 10 proposed offshore wind projects totaling 25 gigawatt in the market and many more transmission projects. In the context, I think it's a perfect time for us to zoom in further opportunities offered in the Australian wind market, as well as the challenges that need to be addressed head-on. Luckily, today we are very honored to have with us two industry experts to help touch on the market current, as well as to make our business a bit easier. Starting with Dr. Joe Gilmore, General Manager, Energy Policy and Planning at Iberdrola. He will give us a bit more insights on the onshore wind developments in Australia and the risk mitigation strategies that are currently adopted by Iberdrola. Followed by our second presenter, Mr. Paul Curnow, partner in Sydney with law firm Ashra. Ashra is one of the leading law firms in the global clean energy domain, and Paul will help us deep dive into the latest legal developments in Australia's offshore wind market. As today we will have a very interesting and topical talk, I would like to encourage everyone using the Q&A box below to raise your questions. And some other housekeeping notes are on the screen. If you encounter any audio or video issues, please refresh your browser. And I think 99% of the questions can be solved. And if you want to send greetings to other audience, please use the chat box. You can name who you are, what's your company, and where are you joining from. Ask questions is the most important task to do in this seminar. Each presenter will be given 30 minutes combining 20-minute presentation and a 10-minute Q&A. So please feel free to raise the questions roaming on your mind. And last but not least, recordings. Recordings will be available later this week, so please don't worry about it. Before we get everything started, a quick overview of our participants today mostly are the onshore and offshore wind players in the market and in a wider region. As today is going to be a very intensive session, without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to our first presenter, Dr. 𝐓𝐨𝐬𝐜𝐬. Just a bit introduction before I have Joe taking control. Dr. Joe is General Manager for Energy Policy and Planning at Iberdrola, Australia, with over a decade of experience in market design, modeling, technical and economic analysis of integrating renewable energy into the grid. He leads 𝐓𝐸𝐺𝐻's long-term market modeling team and develops business cases for both renewable and firming assets. He was previously a senior manager at Ernst & Young Consulting, managing projects such as modeling and design for the Victorian renewable energy target, and has held various roles with the Queensland government and AEMO. Joe is also an associate professor at Griffith University Business School. Now it's time to welcome Joe on stage. Dr. Joe, can you switch the screen to your side and fire up your presentation?
That is definitely the big question. Let's see if I can get this to share. Can you see my presentation there?
Yes, I can see it very clear.
Fantastic. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today, Molly, and for that warm introduction. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many, many lands that we're meeting on today and pay my respect to elders both past and present. It's also good to acknowledge that the first people of Australia were some of the world's first scientists as they discovered how to use the land that they lived on and how to work with it and care for it. So there is lots of lessons to be learnt for us all there, particularly as we work to harness the natural resources of our country. So my name is Joel. I work for Iberdrola. Previously, I worked for Infigen Energy, and we were acquired by Iberdrola last year, which is a Spanish company, and they are one of the largest utilities in the world. So it's a very exciting time to be with Iberdrola and involved in renewable energy here in Australia. Just very brief, this is the, a little bit of the marketing moment of the presentation, just to introduce who Iberdrola is. So we have a fleet of renewable energy assets that we have built and others that we have contracted, about 670 megawatts, although that number is out of date as of this morning because we just announced that we're developing a new solar farm in New South Wales, a 245 megawatt solar farm. So that's very exciting today, and congrats to all the Iberdrola team on getting that off the ground. The session is to talk about risk and how we manage risk around these investments. And I will talk about more of that in a moment. But one really important thing for us is that we sell our energy to customers as our primary hedging strategy. So we have large commercial and industrial customers that we sell to. And a big part of our strategy is how do you take the variable energy from our wind and solar farms and firm that up to deliver the firm energy that our customers want. And so to do that, we have a fleet of firming assets. So that is gas turbines, diesel turbines that are currently turning into gas, and of course, batteries. We have a Lake Bonny battery and a new battery in New South Wales that is under construction. And so we're able to use this fleet of renewables and firming to deliver, I think, not just firm energy, but also innovative products to our customers. We're able to really work with them to shape our products, to shape the prices, and of course, to deliver green energy, which is so critically important for our and many other customers in Australia. And this is really important because while the sale of PPAs was historically a really important part of the renewable energy industry in Australia, Increasingly, those PPAs are not at a price or duration that perhaps offers the maximum value. So by managing these contracts ourselves and directly those customer relationships, we're able to capture more value and have a clearer path to market, a route to market for our assets. That's really important for us. And I think increasingly, we had Infigen previously described ourselves as the utility of the future, and that is very much how Iberdrola sees it. And we don't have any interest in having large inflexible coal power stations as part of our portfolio. So, I should also mention we, just in terms of development assets, we are still very much in this game of developing assets. We have a combined solar wind farm under construction in South Australia. This is a really exciting project with about 270 megawatts of export capacity, and that is well underway to being developed. And of course, as I said, we have a new solar farm in New South Wales as of today, and you can see our post about that on LinkedIn if you want more details. So what I want to talk about today was, of course, this wind risk and investability. And one thing that we're hearing a lot, if you read the media, if you listen potentially to governments, is the NEM is not investable. So the NEM is the National Electricity Market, the main electricity market in Australia. And even the Energy Security Board, which is a body put together with the heads of the major energy regulators in the NEM, have been making some very bold claims that the NEM is no longer investable, that we have a lack of investment, particularly in firming technology, but also potentially in new renewables, that there are these barriers to investment. And I really want to explore that idea today. So to consider where we're going in the future, I think it's helpful to look at where we have been, and perhaps this will help understand why there are these concerns. So we have just come out of what we would call an investment mega cycle. And I want to kind of just step you through a little story here. So this picture here is the plot over time of the last about 20 years. And the dotted line is the underlying electricity price, the annual price for electricity in the NEM. And the solid line is the electricity price plus the green price. So this is the renewable energy target, or a renewable portfolio standard, that is tracked using these green certificates called LGCs, large scale generation certificates. And those prices there, you can see that over the last few years really shot up. And this was driven by a few really critical drivers. The first was the closure of some major coal power stations that were not forecasted in advance. 12 months before their closure, or at least their announcement, there was not even speculation by the market operator, the main forecaster of these closures. So that caught at least some of the market by surprise. In parallel, we saw rising gas prices. We saw the cost of gas in Australia go from $2 or $3 a gigajoule to $10 to $12 a gigajoule, which had a real impact on prices. And this led to, as I said, high spot prices, but also at the same time, we have seen wind costs falling, as has happened all around the world. So the dots here are the PPA, the power purchase agreement prices that we were able to find publicly. Now, this is from a paper that Paul Simshauser and I wrote through Griffith University. And the green line there is that average price. So you can see that it came down, and really came down a lot just at the same time as wholesale prices went up. So this led to what I think you'd have to call gold rush conditions. We saw a huge glut of capacity entering the market because prices were high, costs were low. And this was not helped by this renewable energy target having a 2020 cutoff date. And we'd gone through a long period of thinking the target wouldn't be met, or the target might be cancelled. And then suddenly we had certainty, yes, the target is going ahead. And so everyone was rushing to enter. And what we saw was 105 individual projects entering the market in just 3 years. That's a lot of projects. And so it is inevitable that there were some mistakes made. Not mistakes in planning, but in hindsight. If you build 105 projects in a rush, some of them are probably not going to be as good as you thought. And so because of that, I think we've seen a lot of soul searching as to where does the fault lie? Is it with the NEM or is it with developers? And I think there has been this tendency to blame the NEM, whereas we would say, actually, any time you have a boom and bust scenario in a commodity market, you are going to see some investments which aren't ideal. So that's the kind of the lens that we're thinking about investing in the NEM through at the moment. And if I can show you just one more picture here, I think this is really powerful. This is that same story, that investment by year. And you can see in the past, we mainly invest in coal and gas in grey. And then over the last decade, it has been renewables. And that number has just shot up. And in fact, 43% of NEM investment was done in just 3 years, total dollars to date. So a lot of change. So what then, that's the past, where are we going? What does the future hold? Well, if we're going to have long-term renewable growth, there is a lack of federal policy around climate change, emissions, and particularly around long-term renewable energy targets. So instead, state governments have been stepping in to fill that gap. We also have coal closures that are inevitable, and many of our coal power stations in Australia, which still provides 70 to 80% of our energy, our electricity, many of those coal power stations are approaching 50 years. And so they are going to fail and they are going to close, and they're probably going to do it much quicker than anyone expects. However, that's not a great way to deliver investment, because that leads to, again, those boom and bust cycles in prices, which is not great for anyone. So instead, the states have been stepping in. And I think the flagship state program at the moment is from the New South Wales government. And they developed what is commonly called the New South Wales Roadmap, which is a target for 12 gigawatts of new renewable energy in New South Wales by 2030, which would on its own roughly double the amount of renewable energy in Australia. And then that would be coupled with 2 gigawatts of long duration storage, energy storage. And the intent of this scheme is to ensure that the replacement capacity we need for those coal closures is ready to go. New South Wales doesn't want to be left holding the bag. So this is a fantastic scheme. We very much support it. And alongside the New South Wales scheme, there is a 50% renewable energy target from Victoria and a 50% renewable energy target from Queensland. Victoria recently announced their next auction, a reverse auction for renewable energy. And Queensland has a government-owned utility, which is buying projects or PPAs and helping to develop them. So those schemes are underway and are going to be very important, but it's the New South Wales scheme that I think it's worth talking about a little bit more at the moment, because it, excuse me, it highlights some of the design choices that we have available. Oh, and sorry, also just want to mention the renewable energy zones. So this is a initiative that I think most of the state governments are pushing at the moment, which is developing new transmission to unlock new renewable resources. And this is, of course, how energy worked in the past. We would build power lines to where there was coal mines. And now we're trying to do the same thing with renewables. And I think it's a really forward-looking approach. Excuse me. So, just to touch briefly on this design option around the New South Wales roadmap, the current design is to go out for the government to hold auctions, reverse auctions for CFDs, which are effectively PPAs, but with the government. The thing the New South Wales government is doing differently is to do it through swaptions, effectively options for PPAs, where they would hopefully act like a floor price. Now, this is certainly not a terrible scheme, but it does have some drawbacks, Because if the government is going out and asking you to bid, I need $60 a megawatt hour, or I need $50 a megawatt hour, it's very hard to compare different projects. So maybe you have a wind farm that is more expensive, but will deliver more valuable energy. Maybe it's more correlated with the evening. So you have a cost of $60, but will deliver $70 of value. In contrast, somebody else might have a project with a cost of $50, but only $55 of value. It's very difficult for governments to compare. And it makes it very difficult to assess the emissions abatement potential of these projects, the cost of those projects, and ultimately means that consumers are exposed to risks of up to the total amount of the PPA if those wholesale prices happen to go to zero. So this is not a terrible scheme, but we are proposing there are ways you could do this better. And that way is to leverage the same idea of this renewable energy target we have now, which is to ask projects to bid for the top up they require for new investment. So if you have your project and you think you can earn $60 in the market, but your costs are $70, you would say to the government that I need a top up of $10 a megawatt hour. Another project might say I only need a top up of $2 a megawatt hour. And it makes it a really clear way for the government to assess the good projects from the bad projects without the government having to make their own price forecast or their own assessment of which project is going to deliver most value to consumers. It also means that now there is a really clear price value. If you use LGCs, these renewable certificates, as the currency for this top-up, we have a really clear linkage to the cost of a green project in New South Wales, and hence we can link to other abatement schemes in transport or even international offsets. So that's a very brief introduction because this is a very complex topic, but I think it's something worth getting across if you're thinking about the investment here. And just to sort of one more point on that, which is to say that there is an argument that by signing these CFDs that completely de-risk a project, or at least have the potential to de-risk a project, that will help reduce the costs. And I'm skeptical that that picture is quite as simple, because at the end of the day, you can't destroy risk. These projects ultimately still have to be sold to customers. And that means somewhere a retailer is taking on this risk. The best case outcome is that some of that risk is transferred to taxpayers. And now you're just kind of hiding it as part of the tax. So I think there's some challenges there. And it's also worth noting that there is some $10 billion worth of refinancing on debt that needs to happen in the next couple of years. So we want to really be careful about how we treat our existing projects in the market as well. And if we're just subsidizing new projects and not valuing the existing investments, then that's going to have flow on to the banks and other finance institutions. So we do need to be aware of that. So to sort of then think about the future, what are the real problems for investment in the NEM? Well, it's all of these missing markets. We are going to have a much more rapid transition than anybody expects. So we need to think about how do we deliver system strength? And this is an issue that's really quite Australian specific at the moment, but will come up in other markets inevitably. That is, how do we ensure that we can hold the grid together, that we can measure and detect faults on the network, and that the voltage is stable? So we have a shortfall of system strength in Australia, and we're only just in the process of developing a mechanism to procure that. Similarly, inertia. This is the stability of the system, the resistance to change. When something goes wrong, how long do we have to react? And we don't have any market or any way of valuing the inertia that traditionally comes from synchronous units like coal generators, but in the future might be delivered by batteries, grid-forming inverters, synchronous condensers. So we need to move very quickly to create those price signals to ensure we have what we need. We need to have timely investment in new transmission. We have traditionally lagged building new transmission lines, which means that we have curtailment and congestion. And that's led to, you can see here some data, this is a year or two old now, but there have been huge delays on a lot of the projects that were developed in the NEM due to all of these constraints I've just talked about: lack of transmission, lack of system strength, lack of, just working out how do you model a grid once you get to 50, 60, 100% renewable energy. It's also, I think, important to reflect on the problems that we don't have. The first is the energy-only market in the NEM, I think, is the best possible market for the future. It values projects that deliver reliability, and it doesn't pay projects that just sit there and don't deliver. So the alternative is capacity markets, which I know is very popular in the United States and in other countries. But it's very hard to provide capacity signals that value assets correctly. How much capacity is a 2-hour battery worth? A 1-hour battery, a 4-hour battery? We don't really want a central operator to make those decisions. We, who the utilities, the ones who actually have the renewables, actually have the customers, in our view, we're best placed to decide how valuable these assets are for us. So we should let the financial markets sort that out. And that has been an overwhelming consensus view from industry in Australia at the moment, is that the energy-only market is a great way to go, and the capacity markets don't really have a lot of value. There's a few exceptions to that, but they're typically large coal power stations or companies with large coal portfolios that would love to be paid for capacity that doesn't need to be flexible and doesn't need to be deliver all of the flexibility and services that we need. The other thing which I don't think is a problem is the locational signals. In the NEM, we have very strong signals through loss factors, marginal loss factors that scale your revenue. And we have signals through a very transparent market that can tell you where there is congestion in the NEM. Now, yes, there have been some projects that have been built that have not built in a good location. But remember, 105 projects in 3 years, sure. In hindsight, maybe we built too many projects in one area, or maybe we haven't built enough transmission. So my call to action is very much on the let's develop all of those missing markets and those missing services that have caused so many delays and challenges and uncertainty for investors. And then we can worry about these other problems. And of course, on top of all that, let's get a national enduring carbon scheme in place. That'll be the #1 thing that will make it easier to invest. Because if we add more renewables, we will reduce our emissions. So I'm almost out of time there. So I'm going to wrap up there and go to questions. I hope that sort of gave you a little bit of insight into the thinking that Iberdrola has at the moment around the future investing. We see there is lots of opportunities and a really great time to invest, but it is going to require sophisticated investors that can understand the complexity of the market that we operate in and make really good decisions. But I think that we're going to find that in Australia. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zhou. This is a very informative and inspiring presentation, and I really love your passionate style. Yeah. So I think as the audience needs some time to write down their questions, perhaps we can go through some of them that has been collected during the pre-registration.
Absolutely.
Just give me one moment. So the first question goes to what change to regulation that are not on the table right now would assist in the growth of the wind sector. I think this question resonates with the one that is currently remaining in the open box from Daniel D. Witt. For Joe, what mechanism do you think will be the key driver for the creation of the currently missing markets in the renewable energy industry or in the NEM?
Yeah, great question. So I think a lot of it is being driven by industry at the moment. So industry is really a painfully aware of where the pain points are for new investment. And so I and a couple of others from Iberdrola proposed 2 rule changes last year, one of which has been accepted, which is to develop a new fast frequency response market, a very rapid reserves market to value the reserves from batteries or demand response. In terms of the regulations that are not on the table right now, inertia seems to be the big one. We don't yet have a market for that. Reserves, how do we provide confidence to governments that there is going to be enough power to keep the lights on? And I think that's a really important question. How do we make sure there's enough reserves? And all of this, I mean, in the NEM, it's a fairly transparent process. It's around the rule changes and the framework there where anybody can propose a change to the rules that is then evaluated on its merit. So I guess to answer that, I think industry needs to drive rule changes and needs to advocate for good policy. I hope that sort of helps.
Yes.
That.
Yes, and we see a lot of progresses that are being developed in the state government. How about the federal government?
Look, it's a good question. I saw New South Wales today just announced a 50% emissions reduction target for New South Wales by 2030, which is huge. It might not be quite enough to get to 1.5 degrees, to keep temperature 1.5 degrees, but it's a huge step in the right direction. I think the federal government, it is great to focus on technologies and to the necessary technologies for the future, but ultimately we need actionable short-term targets. And the science says that we need to reduce our emissions by at least 50% by 2030 as a country. So it's absolutely critical that we develop frameworks to do that. And some form of emissions intensity scheme for the electricity sector, I think, would be really positive.
Yes, and we also got one question from the Q&A box from Andrew. Do you feel the current Supreme Court case against Bald Hill Wind Farm will have a detrimental effect on the future of companies building wind farms? I'm not very familiar with the legal aspects. Do you want to take that question?
Is this the one about noise levels and neighbours being complaining? I think that's the case. Look, I don't know the specifics of that. Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Disgruntled neighbours. Yeah, look, I don't know the specifics of that, and I sort of wouldn't want to comment there. But I think it does really highlight just how important community engagement is for development in Australia. And you can do this well and you can do this badly. And so you need to bring that community along, make sure that everybody is getting some benefit from this project and understands the benefits to Australia. I don't think it's the end of the story for developments in Australia, but I do think that some of this work around renewable energy zones where we're trying to get sort of projects approved, have that community buy-in ahead of time is really helpful.
Great. I think Andrew's satisfied with that answer. And let's move on to the second question. It's about the grid issues. Do you think it's enough being done to ensure the transmission network is able to cope with the increase in renewables? I think the answer is absolutely no, but any more comments on that?
Yeah, look, again, it's always hard because we don't want to overbuild transmission because that costs money. But also if we underbuild transmission, it means we're not going to get the least cost resources, or we're going to have congestion or delays. And my view is these risks are asymmetric. If you build a little bit too much transmission, well, yes, you've probably spent too much money now, but it'll probably be used in the future. If you don't build enough, then we're going to have much higher energy costs because we're not going to be able to build the projects that we need. And we're not going to be able to reduce emissions enough to stave off catastrophic climate change. So, but in terms of is enough being done, I think the work that the state governments are doing on renewable energy zones is really great. There's a really forward-looking approach to how do we get new transmission in. We just need to make sure that we're also keeping the flexibility to build the best projects in the best location. And there's some ideas around from the Energy Security Board, the ESB, around this congestion management model, which would effectively prevent people from building projects unless a government or the ESB thinks it's a good location. And I don't think that's a great outcome. You know, yes, we want to utilize renewable energy zones, but we also need to let people, you know, take a chance on a project. And if they build a bad project, well, that's on us as investors, as long as taxpayers aren't paying for it.
Yes. And with regards to question number 4, as you mentioned, the ESB 2025 plan, will it influence any investment decisions?
Look, it's a really hard question. You know, there is a lot of, I guess, discussion, debate going on around the ESB's plan at the moment. And there are some good things in there, and there are what I would call some not so good things. So that's still being hashed out. At the moment, I don't think there is anything likely to come out of that is going to fundamentally hurt investment, as long as the capacity market proposals don't go ahead, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of appetite there. There might be some opportunities to help investment if we're able to, you know, drive in additional, yeah, exactly, additional flexibility. But I really think that it's the state governments that are the big influences at the moment in terms of the future of projects.
Yes. And now the third question about future opportunities of battery storage system for wind farm projects. I believe there are some regulatory advancements with regard to encouraging wind projects incorporating battery storage projects.
Yeah, some really great stuff from the from AEMO, the energy market operator. And that's been taken up by, or at least proposed by the AEMC, who makes the rules around these hybrid facilities. So some really innovative ways that you could incorporate a battery, either AC coupled behind the connection point or DC coupled with your project, and have a lot of flexibility in terms of how you use and bid that battery. So I think there's some really good opportunities there. There is some potential challenges. A draft rule from the AEMC proposes charging batteries for quite significant transmission costs. And that would be, I think, very challenging for future battery investment. So definitely worth, if you're a potential investor, engaging in that process, understanding what that might mean. But you know, those DC coupled batteries, being able to reuse infrastructure, I think has a lot of potential. And we are going to need a lot of storage going out into the future. So it's a good opportunity.
It's a good news for all the battery suppliers and developers in the market, finding a chance to collaborate with Iberdrola. And now let's go to the 5th question, question number 5, Iberdrola's prospects on offshore wind and how to manage major risks in offshore wind development. Perhaps you can touch a bit on that question.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I mean, this I think is going to be very much addressed by our next speaker in a moment around the offshore opportunities. We're certainly watching the offshore space, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Obviously, it's a new it's a new type of technology for Australia, at least, with some learnings for us to have here. I think at the end of the day, it's going to be the cost that is the biggest challenge. That there are a lot of good onshore wind sites, so you're going to have a really good offshore project to get across the line. So I won't say too much about where we're, you know, what we may or may not be looking at there, but it is an interesting space and one that certainly internationally is growing. So we want to make sure that we as a business stay on top of that as it matures here.
Yes, we see offshore wind as a great opportunity, and but still, I think in the next 3 to 5 years, the future will still be onshore wind as a dominant source. So I really look forward to more progress from Iberdrola and more business success from your side.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I really appreciate this presentation. And now let's invite out our second speaker of today, Mr. 𝐓𝐤𝐬𝐈𝐧𝐜𝐥𝐮𝐝𝐞. May you kindly do a brief introduction about yourself, because you are a very good talker.
Thanks, Molly. That's very kind of you to say. Paul Curnow, partner at Ashurst. I'm also one of the global co-leads for energy at Ashurst and coordinate our efforts globally, and in particular here in the APAC region around the energy transition. I've spent 20 years in the renewables, clean energy, climate and carbon space across many markets, helping a range of clients enter markets, develop projects, take them through to financial close and operation. Lots of policy work along the way, and a lot of the structuring, particularly around PPAs, including corporate PPAs. So it's good to be here. Today, I'm going to sort of talk, of course, around offshore wind. So I'm just going to pull up my slides while we get ready for that. So just give me a second.
Yes, a few more add-on points, as Paul is being very humble and modest. Paul has extensive experience in all aspects of clean energy markets, including in project development, innovative offtake arrangements, energy regulation, and financing. Paul also acted as General Counsel of Australia's Clean Energy Finance Corporation from its setup in 2013, overseeing the legal execution of the financing of clean energy projects and reporting to the CEFC board. Also, Paul is a teaching fellow at the University of New South Wales Law School, where he lectures in renewable energy law. So he is very experienced and very humble.
You're very kind, Molly. Thank you. So I've got the slides up. Hopefully everyone can see that now.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Yeah. So there is a green button called Share Screen at the bottom of the panel.
Let me try that. It should be there now.
Great. Got it.
There we go. Great. Okay. So thanks again, and just want to also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land where I'm presenting to you from today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and also pay my respects to elders past, present, and future, and echo the comments that Joel made in his introduction. So I'm going to cover off on just looking at the offshore wind opportunities, particularly in the Australian context. It's a very, very new nascent market. No projects have been developed as yet. So we're really at the start of this journey, but obviously catching up on many other markets around the world, as Joel and Molly mentioned. So I'll touch on the regulatory regime that's just been introduced to federal parliament here in Australia, explain how the licensing regime is going to work, and look at some of the key issues for offshore wind projects. I should mention that, of course, what I'm presenting on in terms of the regulatory framework is just in respect of the Commonwealth legislation. And of course, that governs the sea waters 3 nautical miles or beyond 3 nautical miles. And so the other piece of the puzzle here, of course, is the 3 nautical miles, part of the sea and the seabed, and of course, where and how you connect onshore, which of course is all part of state and territory regulatory jurisdiction. And so that's the bit that is still open as to how that's going to develop. So just in terms of the offshore wind opportunities, I think it's worth just having a look here at this map. And I've just focused here on the NEM states. There are, of course, opportunities in Western Australia, and we've seen a few potential sites being earmarked in the Western Australian market. But in terms of the national electricity market, the AEMO has actually, but given feedback, has actually included some offshore wind zones in its ISP planning. You can see there the blue parts, which reflect, I guess, 4 key offshore wind zones off the Hunter Coast, around sort of coming out from the port of Newcastle, the Illawarra coast coming out from the port of Wollongong. Then you've got the Gippsland coast, which is probably where we've seen most of the initial interest and activity, and of course also the northwest and the north coast of Tasmania. And of course the second potential Bass link or Marinus link between mainland Australia and Tasmania is going to be certainly very key to the development of that area. So there's a lot of work that's been done looking at these potential areas, and that's relevant when we talk about the declaration that the minister will make in terms of zones. This map also shows the hydrogen ports or hydrogen hubs, and the government, the federal government and states are of course heavily focused as well on hydrogen, particularly for export. And so I'll talk about this later in the presentation, but certainly the correlation of hydrogen production for export and the positioning and potential offshore wind, I think, has an interesting relationship that we'll see unfold. So I guess one of the big challenges in Australia compared to some other markets, particularly if you look at in Europe and Northern Europe into the North Sea, is that generally we've got limited shallow waters or sufficiently shallow depth waters for traditional offshore wind. And so a lot of the expectation here is, particularly if you look at the New South Wales coast, that's all going to likely be done as floating technology. And of course, there's question marks, and I think still a lot of work to be done in looking at the overall cost. And I think that's a key point that Joel made. You know, the cost versus, I guess, the cost ability of offshore wind to compete with onshore renewables, including onshore wind, remains to be seen, particularly in some of these areas where it may be required to use floating technology rather than fixed. And certainly, you know, the depth of the sea beds will have a big impact on that. Having said that, there's definitely a lot of interest. Key players are obviously looking at the potential in terms of both location and looking at the demand for offshore wind and how that will play into the onshore policies. So let's now, with that backdrop, just turn to look at the legislation that's been introduced to federal parliament. So this is the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Bill. So it does specifically talk about electricity. It's not just for offshore wind. And that's deliberate to capture a single regime from a policy point of view that can also facilitate particularly for ongoing research and development on other ocean technologies. So the legislation itself establishes a framework for the construction, operation, maintenance, decommissioning of offshore electricity projects. I'll talk about wind in this because that's really where we think the main focus and interest will be. Importantly, it's worth noting that the legislation is heavily modelled off the Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Management Act, which governs the offshore production of petroleum and related greenhouse gas reporting and requirements in respect of that. So we've got the National Offshore Petroleum Titles Administrator, NOPTA, that is likely to become the registrar in respect of licenses and the process for handing those out and assessing those. And then you've got the National Offshore Petroleum Safety Environmental Management Authority, NOPSEMA, which is likely to be the regulator. So some key features of the bill: it introduces a new licensing scheme specifically for offshore wind and other electricity generation. It establishes declared areas, safety zones and protection zones that relate to either defence or fishing or protected areas in terms of environmental and marine species. And it also importantly requires the preparation of management plans covering all of those sorts of issues, from work health and safety through to environmental protection and related issues, as well as providing financial security for decommissioning. And it provides for the application of the work health and safety legislation to apply in respect of that offshore area. So the legislation was introduced into Parliament on the 2nd of September. Comments were due 15 September, and the bill now has been referred off to a Senate committee for further inquiry and report back by 14 October. There seems to be good bilateral support for this bill. I don't think there's any particular opposition to allowing this framework to be developed, particularly as a way to help further enable the development of the market. In terms of timing, I'll come back to that at the end, as I know there are a few questions around likely timing. So the proposed regulatory regime really focuses around 3 types of license streams. So the commercial, I'll talk about commercial and feasibility license because that's the primary focus. The other is research and demonstration, and that really goes to my point about this being in respect of electricity generally, even though we expect most of you focus around offshore wind, but the R&D license category certainly allows others to undertake smaller R&D type projects. And then there's also transmission and related infrastructure license in respect of the cabling that brings the electricity back on shore. So I'll touch on these more as we go through. So I guess in terms of requirements of offshore wind projects generally, it's worth noting that there's going to be a process for assessing the capacity, the technical and financial capacity of a proponent to carry out the proposed project. So the idea here is that people will be putting in proposals once the call for licenses opens up. And as we've seen in the offshore petroleum regime, a process to assess the financial and technical capacity of proponents to carry out the project. The project has to be likely to be viable. There's an assessment around the actual project, and the proponent must be a suitable person to hold the license. And also there's a requirement to meet any other criteria. The detail of this, the merit criteria, is really, of course, going to be in the regulations, and that's what's being worked through at the moment. So this is just the bare bones in the legislation. As part of the application to get a feasibility license, there's a management plan that's required to be completed, which will set out how that proponent is going to meet all of the operational, work health and safety, environmental and other matters as part of the feasibility phase, but also that management plan will have a role in converting that feasibility license into a commercial license. So the next point there is around EPBC approval. So rather than try and have a mirror regime in terms of environmental approvals, the idea here is to piggyback off the existing EPBC Act at the Commonwealth level, and to basically use that as a way to deal with approvals in respect of the environmental issues. As I mentioned, there's a decommissioning bond, so all applicants will be required to provide appropriate financial security. And then, of course, as you'd expect, there's a requirement to comply with all regulations, or all directions from the regulator. So the proposed regulatory regime, other regulatory matters, there'll be safety zones in respect of temporary exclusion zones extending as far as 500 metres from eligible infrastructure. Interestingly, it's going to be to see how the, I guess, the fisheries and the fishing industries look at this, and the nature of the way the turbines are actually developed. We do see some interest in the way that can either affect fishing operations or potentially enhance. So there'll be a lot of consultation around that. As I mentioned, the Work Health and Safety Act 2011 will apply in respect to these offshore projects. There'll be protection zones that will prohibit further activities from being undertaken that may pose serious risk to either human safety or offshore infrastructure. and then of course all of the compliance and enforcement requirements that will be vested in the regulator. So just before I go into the key challenges, just to sort of come back to the license streams in respect of feasibility and commercial. So the expectation is that the minister will declare the zones based on all of that inputs that are publicly available, and also research done specifically by the department to look at viable areas for offshore wind. So the ISP sets out the 4 or 5 already, but they're likely to be more than that. There's also a consultation process that will be opened up to get input from proponents as to which areas they're interested in. So the idea is that by the time the minister makes declaration in respect of the first and subsequent zones, that will be based on a lot of input from both the industry and relevant technical advisors as to viable areas. Those zones areas, or those areas that are designated areas, are expected to be quite large, perhaps up to 10,000 square kilometres. And then there'll be a call for proposals or call for applications for a feasibility license. So our expectation is that there won't be it's not a full auction in the sense of bidding off capacity like we've seen in other markets. It's probably going to be pretty unlikely that 2 proponents are going to be looking to develop a wind farm, offshore wind farm in exactly the same area. The legislation does make provision for a way to manage that financially, that there could be a bidding of a price in order to be granted that feasibility license. But the expectation is there's going to be a reasonably orderly process through the call for feasibility license applications to be granted a feasibility license in respect of a reasonably large area and not a huge amount of competition. And I think that's important because it's quite different to the very competitive, more sort of plug and play model we've seen in particularly European markets. The other point to note is that the feasibility license can be converted then into a commercial license. There's an additional process or some additional eligibility criteria, but there's no competitive process again to be granted the commercial license. So once you have the feasibility license and you comply with that and you keep moving the project through and meet the commercial eligibility criteria, which again relates to financial and technical capacity to develop the project and its viability, you can then apply for and be granted a commercial license. The transmission license will sort of go hand in hand with that. It's not, and that's really just to cover the way in which the cables will be laid back to shore and give rights in respect of laying those cables on the seabed. It's not in of itself meant to be a separate competitive process. It does leave open the possibility that third parties could provide the transmission and effectively apply for a license and potentially aggregate transmission and offer that to different projects in one zone. And so the legislation is sort of agnostic as to how commercially parties might group together to develop that. So just conscious of the time, I guess some of the key challenges, issues here, and happy then, Molly, to take some questions. And I know there were a few that came through beforehand. I guess one of the key questions is when and how will these declared areas be made? Timing-wise, the expectation is that legislation should pass Parliament by this side of Christmas, and or early next year. There's royal assent only happens 6 months after the legislation passes, which is in order to give time for the regulations to be developed. So the expectation is that we could see the first call for feasibility license in the latter half of 2022, and that's, I think, the current expectation and preferred timing. So I think this is going to happen reasonably quickly, certainly coming off a low base in terms of no regime to first feasibility license applications this time next year. I guess what are the merit criteria? You can certainly have a look at the UK and other markets in terms of what they've done. I think it'd be reasonable to expect that the regulations in respect of merit criteria are going to sort of be modelled off what we've seen in other markets, but also what we see in the existing offshore petroleum legislation. License costs, the indications there is it's going to be just a nominal amount, an amount that covers the administrative costs of the government and regulatory bodies to manage the Act and apply and process applications, but no sort of higher pricing than that. Foreign investment isn't touched on in this legislation, so that'll be something that, from a policy point of view, will need to be dealt with under the existing foreign investment legislation and FIRB considerations. So we would expect that, like investment in generation and other grid infrastructure onshore has foreign investment requirements, that would also apply in future to any offshore developments, depending on the size and cost of investment. And I mentioned then again the transmission licenses and the way in which perhaps third parties could aggregate transmission and offer that as a service, which probably comes to one of the first questions, Molly, and I'll pause after this, around how viable is this market? We talked about cost versus what's available onshore, but you've also got to think about the supply chains. And if you look at the offshore supply chains, they're obviously quite different in terms of using ships and other very specific equipment, and getting that and bringing that all down to Australia probably means, I think, you need a certain critical mass of projects to probably make that supply chain work and be financially at the right price. It's not so much a technical or like a technical capability issue, but more around, I think, the overall costs, including economies of scale, particularly when you look at that supply chain. So I might just pause there, Molly, and happy to take any questions that have come through. Plus, we can pick up on any of the questions that were put in before part of the registration.
Yes, please allow me to switch the screen to my side. Just give me one moment. Paul, I think you have touched on some of the questions during your presentation, but just to record that answer so we can keep a record on this page. So when are the recently announced bill is likely to be legislated? I heard it would be around October this year.
Yeah, I think it's, well, it comes back from the Senate committee 14 October. Yeah, I think I hear that the government would quite like to take the past legislation as another announcement to Glasgow, to COP26. So maybe we'll see that by the end of October.
Yeah.
If it's not, yeah. Otherwise, definitely, I think before Christmas.
I think basically the overall document would be kept, or do you expect there will be some amendments at the in last minute?
Yeah, I suspect that's what we'll see coming out of the Senate committee, whether there's any more specific changes to legislation. I think given that a lot of the detail will be in the regulations, that's probably where, and I think they have to be tabled, or at least they'll go out for consultation. So I think that's where we'll see most of the focus, because that's where all the detail is.
Noted. And as everybody is following the demonstration projects, what is the realistic year for starting offshore wind in Australia? Like when we can expect the ground activities?
Yeah, I think it's still several years away. Even if you think about getting a feasibility license at the earliest end of 2022, those licenses can run up to 7 years. So, in terms of feasibility and then actually commencing, reaching financial close, and I'll talk about on the later questions around some of the demand that's driving the market. But Yeah, I think we're talking several years still before we get to that point.
Yes, and as you mentioned about the licensing process in onshore wind market, we see a lot of projects are being delayed, and the same questions apply to the offshore wind market. How long would the licensing period be? For example, the construction licensing period. Sorry, just give me one moment. But for example, the ESIA periods. How long do you expect to acquire its permits?
Yeah, I don't know how long. I guess it's going to take several months of assessment from the regulator or the registrar to look at applications. And then, of course, I think a key part of that is how long does it take you as a proponent to prepare your management plan? Because all the detail against which you have to meet the requirements will be in that management plan. So that will take several months as well. I guess the key point to make here is, as I said at the beginning, we're dealing just with the Commonwealth Waters regime, which of course is critical for the location and operation of the wind turbines. But I think the big unknown at the moment is what are the policy settings that will drive demand onshore for that offshore generation. Now, obviously, at the moment, you could lay a cable and bring it onshore and apply to Transgrid to connect, probably with not a huge amount of changes to existing legislation within the NEM or with state level requirements. There's enough state level environmental and planning approvals frameworks that could potentially allow this to happen. But we would expect that once the states see the legislation pass and the first zones are declared, that the states will start looking at their own regulatory requirements to manage that onshore waters and how they can connect. So that's sort of the technical point. The other point there, though, is when you step back from all of this, and I think this is the big question mark of onshore wind, what is the demand for offshore wind in terms of meeting onshore loads? And I think if you look at just decarbonising our own national electricity market, then you have to compete with onshore generation in terms of price. Who knows if we get there? Probably in the 2030s, once you've got a more mature market, if it gets to that point, you could potentially see that happening. I guess 2 points to note there. One is social license to operate onshore. We do have a lot of available land. We've seen a lot of success, good community engagement to do a lot of projects. But if you look even at New South Wales and the 12 gigawatts to be built in the next 10 years in New South Wales onshore, I think there are some question marks about the tolerance of different communities for a lot more onshore projects. So that may be one driver for offshore. The other point, as I mentioned at the beginning, was hydrogen. And if you look at your hydrogen hubs and what we're trying to do in terms of being an exporter of green hydrogen, then that means we have to have a lot more generation than just decarbonising the NEM. And again, maybe offshore wind will be a critical path or a key to unlocking that green hydrogen. But again, that means we have to bring the cost down. That's going to make that green hydrogen, attractive in those export markets. So to me, the demand markets for offshore wind is not yet clear. And that's not to say the state governments might not actually just look to drive offshore wind with a dedicated policy. So, you could imagine that the Victorian government does VRET 3, a third round of VRET. Maybe that's dedicated just for offshore wind. You could imagine New South Wales potentially doing an auction on Maltesers that also feeds, that's just for offshore wind. So there's a lot of policy mechanisms, as Joel mentioned, that could be used to drive the offshore wind. But at the moment, we have no concrete policies on the table in respect to that.
Yes, and when we raised the question about offshore wind market to Minister D'Ambrosio in our yesterday's hydrogen session, she said that the main concern for the government is the local community and the jobs it can create for local people. Speaking of the local content criteria in offshore or onshore wind projects, can you sort of clarify a little bit? As we see, there's one question from the Q&A box asked by Daria. What is going to be the target for local content in future projects for both onshore and offshore projects?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Look, I think I specifically asked this question to the federal department. It is not an issue under the Commonwealth legislation. They won't be mandating any local content. It doesn't really fit within that regime because it's just a licensing regime. So any local content job creation around offshore wind projects is going to be driven at a state level in terms of state policies, I think, and state requirements. Because well, that's not to say that the Commonwealth couldn't have a separate policy, but at least this framework, this licensing framework, isn't contemplating any particular local content requirements.
Yes, and also one more question from Raphael. How is there clarity how existing offshore infrastructure will be impacted by this legislation?
Yeah, so there is some grandfathering of transmission. So if you think of Basslink, Marislink, some of that, there will be some grandfathering around that. Interestingly, other offshore projects that have already moved ahead, there's no grandfathering within this regime of those, which goes to my point that, in my view, anyone who really, if you assume that this won't be a big market to start, anyone who really is serious and has the capacity and experience of doing offshore wind, then our expectation is they will get a feasibility license. It's not going to be a super competitive process. Yeah, but there's a lot you have to demonstrate, but it's not like you're going to be competing for 500 megawatts and there's people wanting to do 10 gigawatts.
Right. And name the top 3 hurdles in your mind that would, hinder the offshore wind development in Australia. Just top 3.
Top 3. I think it's going to be not being able to get sufficient critical demand to create the supply chains of scale. And if you think about, we would be just one offshore market. We're competing with all the other offshore markets for the same technical inputs, whether it's East Asia or Europe, or even indeed now you look at North America. So I think supply chain and us getting that's going to be difficult. The second would be where is that real demand for offshore wind going to come from? Beyond just decarbonising the NEM. And I guess a related third point to that is, can you do all that in a way that's price competitive, whether that's to compete with onshore renewables or deliver a green hydrogen price that actually is viable?
Of course. And compared with onshore projects, how will offshore wind manage risks differently? Based on your experience, can you give us a bit more insights on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very different in terms of, obviously you have to manage, in many ways it's more complex, in other ways it's perhaps a little easier. If you think about community issues, noise, you don't have those to the same extent. But certainly you've got to manage other users within the marine areas, and that depends on where you are. How far offshore, fishing areas, shipping routes. So I think that's a whole different set of issues that are not dealt with when in onshore. In many ways, onshore projects, because they're typically done on private land, you control access within that area. You can manage that quite contained. You've obviously got noise, and of course ongoing environmental compliance, which would be the same. So yeah, it's just another, I wouldn't say, it's a level of complexity there and different issues which you don't have onshore, but maybe you have some of the other issues which you don't have offshore, which you have onshore.
Absolutely. And we have 2 remaining questions before we wrap up today's session. What is the contrast between the new legislation and the existing REZ zones in terms of things like New South Wales LTESA contracts? Can you touch a bit more on that?
Yeah, so so basically the way to think about it, this legislation is a licensing and approvals legislation. That sort of, it's more like a piece of planning legislation, in that it gives you certain rights to develop and operate a certain type of infrastructure. Whereas the renewable energy zones, they have planning and access rights as part of it as well. But the LTESA contracts that sit on top of the REZs is all about driving that demand for offtake. And this legislation, the Commonwealth legislation, has nothing to do with creating demand. That's really going to depend on other areas. And maybe just to pick up the last question there around potential for corporate PPAs, which is a related point, because I mean, there's no reason the corporate PPA couldn't be signed for an offshore wind. I mean, I think you're going to need quite a large corporate load to capture the size of offshore wind projects, and in Australia that's difficult. We've seen Total Energies in Europe sign a corporate PPA with Liquid Air in Belgium. So definitely corporate PPAs in the offshore wind market is possible. Whether that works in Australia depends on, I think, a number of factors.
Yeah, and how about corporate PPA for onshore projects?
Well,
it's a booming market, right?
Yeah, it's probably slowed down a little bit. I think as corporates realise that the swap PPAs have been entering into perhaps aren't as beneficial as they thought. And I think we're going to see more, and this was to Joel's point, I think a smarter approach to contracting, and that could be building up a stack of PPAs, shorter term ones, maybe for certain blocks of load following generation, and then when you throw batteries into the mix, and the way that generators can use batteries to offer firmed offtake, I think that's also going to change the corporate PPA market. Maybe just one final point there, onshore, linking back to the LTESA model, which Joel walked through. The idea with that put option on the floor price is you would still go into the market and contract other PPAs, and it could potentially be, it could make corporate PPAs more attractive because it removes the downside spot price risk from corporates effectively with that put option. So yeah, a lot of question marks around how that develops, but certainly we see ongoing demand for corporate PPAs onshore.
Great. Thank you so much for detailing the regimes and the project size and all the things related offshore and onshore wind market in Australia. Thank you so much, Paul.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I think this is the end of today's Impact Australia Wind session, and I really appreciate everyone for staying with us. The Impact series will continue as a topic-driven platform for best industry ideas sharing. If you have any interest, in supporting the content creation, please don't hesitate to drop me an email at molly@leaderassociates.com, or we can schedule a further phone call on this. And I'd like to spend the last minute to thank our presenter today, Mr. Paul Colonel and Dr. Joel Gilmore. Thank you so much for your very informative presentation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Thanks so much for
Thank you.
Right to meet you all.
Yeah, please stay in touch.